Okay, there. Okay, everybody. Words for textiles and clothing. And if you look at the picture here, you can see, a little bit of clothing here and hats, and you can see some shoes down here, but you can also see a carpet, and maybe there's a banner in the back and some fringes, and even the umbrellas have something. These older Damson period items, those are a different matter, right? A very different type of clothing. And but I'll include other things that are woven. In fact, my title should be just woven things. That's really what I include in my talk. And as you'll see, to cast a wide net, and in fact, I include the word for net because nets are woven ultimately. The word weave is pretty broad. So I had to include all of them. Okay. So historical linguistics, I'd like to just say something sort of simplistic, but just because we're in an interdisciplinary workshop, something about historical linguistics and ethnohistorical data. Now, central goals of historical linguistics are, of course, in understanding relationships among languages, which includes shared origins and/or language contact. We also reconstruct and track changes of past speech sounds, words, other various linguistic systems and such. And to do that, we use linguistic data. We look at words and sounds and linguistic structural systems and so on, and we analyze it with the comparative method. But if we do only that, it's really at that point just diachronic linguistics. That is, we know that something was something else. A sound was a different sound in the past, and at some point it changed. It's just without respect to history, in fact. And in fact, if we really want to do historical linguistics, then we need extra linguistic data. And extra linguistic, I mean outside of linguistics, historical research, early textual data, archaeology, ethnography, and such. And when we do this, when we take this multidisciplinary approach, I think it is more effective because of the extra linguistic data. It allows us to, when we use historical information, for example, we can support or exclude possibilities based on that real world information. And I think it's more useful and interesting, not just to linguists, but people who are in human history research. And human history research just includes any of these areas I'm talking about. But of course, it requires cautious application and some respect to specialists in other fields. So when I do some of the research, I want to check with specialists to make sure that I'm not just citing the sources, but making sure that what I'm saying is reasonable, or writing is reasonable. And of course, we have to grapple with aspects of the different disciplines. They don't always align. We're looking at things in a different way. We're looking at different data sets. Sometimes they come to very different conclusions. But regardless, I think there has the potential to contribute and fill in information gaps in other disciplines, what historical linguistics has to offer. So hopefully we'll see some of that in some of the talks today. So with that in mind, I've done research on semantic domains, looking at words and not just words in isolation, but semantic domains, focusing especially on Vietic, that is more or less pre-Chăn words in Vietnamese, and Chinese vocabulary in Vietnamese. And I've looked at aspects such as grammatical vocabulary, numeral terms, kinship terms, pronouns, referential terms. None of that particularly requires extra linguistic, material culture, but I've also looked at these aspects of material culture: household structural elements, metals and metal implements, domesticated animals, produce and food preparation, pottery and other ceramics, and clothing, fabrics, and colors. I've looked at these before. Okay, what's different? Well, so I've been taking this approach of looking at entire semantic domains, and I think it's important to consider why. Obviously, we want large amounts of comparative data, which helps us to identify phonological patterns. That's a historical linguistic approach, of course, and that helps us to identify etymological resources and, very crucially, to exclude possibilities when they have weak support. But it is also a matter of structure in these semantic systems. So support for claims of origins of words when words fit into semantic or cultural domains along with other words of the same origin. So I'm not just looking at one word. in a semantic domain. I'm seeing a group of them, and this is related. This relates culture to language, and so I'm still talking about a historical linguistics. I'm not doing, you know, anthropology or something, but it is in a cultural domain. And of course, there's less support when they do not fit. And then when you use these semantic domains, well, it's cultural domains as well. I sometimes use the term, right? They overlap. And there can be support for claims when there is corresponding archaeohistorical information. And again, less support when there are not. So it's a useful way of looking at things, not just looking at words in isolation, but looking them in larger systems, right? So that's reasonable. Now, I have looked at the these words in these categories, but I think my data was a bit smaller. I mean, not too small, 24 Proto-Vietic items and early Chinese loanwords. ECLs means early Chinese loanwords related to clothing, and about 20 color terms. Okay, so that's not bad, but I've expanded. What I did was looked in the Sealang dictionary online, and that looks like this. And so you see it's got some 15,000 entries in it to search through. And when I look for the word silk, I'm not going to just find, you know, silk is this word. It's going to include all entries with silk. So this one happens to have 34 items, and this gives us a good amount of data. And I can then look for something like cloth and find all of the entries with that. So that's the tool I used for searching. Of course, we have to consider the language families in the region. Looking at Vietnamese alone is not very useful. You have to pretty much compare it with all of the neighboring languages and use these various digital databases, very powerful, useful things. And of course, we check our texts, something like ctext.org for Chinese texts, the Gnome Foundation, Gnome texts, although I don't know how extensive that is, and I'm sure that people here will be able to, you know, maybe someone can give me some tips on where another database might be for Gnome. Then we identify our phonological patterns, we consider the archaeohistorical information. So I've assembled data in a spreadsheet, over 150 entries of monosyllabic words and provided notes. Monosyllabic I'm focusing on because when you have bisyllabic words in Vietnamese, that means two actual etymon. So etymon, so it looks something like this, okay? These happen to be two-syllable. I've got both types. So that's what I've done. Okay, so now comes the extra-linguistic part. To provide some context for this, looking at the ethno-historical periods with respect to weaving and textiles in northern Vietnam. Now, to be honest, I found it was easier for me to find archaeological consensus on metals and pottery. Textiles are difficult, I think, because they deteriorate. And so the archaeological information is, I have some that seems pretty good, but I feel on less solid turf, but I will nevertheless give some kind of context. So the Phum Nguyen culture is from this period of really around what's called the Neolithic transition in archaeology, the spread of agriculture. And in this period, there is matte impressed pottery, such as those images you see on the side from actually a little bit later, the Dum Dao culture. Ceramic spindle whorls, the things to spin fiber, and then beaters for bark cloth. And I'll show a picture at the very end of my PowerPoint of a fellow wearing bark cloth. And so even that early period, there is evidence of fiber, but I don't know what they were making. I don't think there are examples of what was being made 4,000 years ago, but this was spread into the region. This is part of the agricultural, the Neolithic package that was spread. That's my understanding of the consensus. Then from the late Neolithic to the early Metal Age, there were obviously metal tools in that period. There's an instance of a bronze retting brush in that Dum Dao culture. Oops, I made a misspelling on Dum, sorry. And, you know, for processing the fiber to make some kind of presumably thread. Iron Age in Vietnam, the spread of Chinese weaving up in the north from the Han Dynasty. In mainland Southeast Asia, apparently there was a spread of cotton from India. That's what I get from the literature. Evidence of looms in the Ao culture down in the south, but Of course, up in northern Vietnam, we're looking primarily at Chinese influence, and we'll see linguistic evidence of that. And I would just call it the kingdoms period, the Mon kingdom, the Angkor later, the Dai kingdoms later on, and growing textile trade, post-Chinese independence in the second millennium in Vietnam. There presumably developments in both native and Chinese influence practices in regional trade. And I'm very general here with this because I can't give much detail for this, but this just provides a little bit of context, archaeohistorical context for the etymological periods and chronology. And so we'll look at when I show the words, I'll show the words which are native vocabulary, and native meaning Proto-Austroasiatic, from that Neolithic transition period. The Austroasiatic dispersal is hypothesized as being corresponding to that, so 4,000 years ago about. For Proto-Vietic, there is no way to determine the age. I have only been using the hypothesized the approximate Metal Age period in northern Southeast Asia, about 1000 BCE. It's just a point of reference because there's no way to know exactly when Vietic was distinct from other branches of Austroasiatic, but that's a period in which sociocultural change would have been prominent. And then Proto-Viet Minh, again, we don't know really what that, what timing would be, but presumably sometime after Chinese contact, somewhere in the first millennium, where groups became different from the other Vietic languages, significantly so. Okay. As for loanwords, Chinese loanwords, I divide them broadly into early Chinese loanwords. I'll use that ECL for early Chinese loanwords for this general period from the Han Dynasty throughout the first millennium, but basically before late Middle Chinese, then late Middle Chinese, which is what we consider to be Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary proper, Chinese character readings. These are basically before the Chinese character readings. These are Chinese character readings, period. That period, okay? As for others, there's really only one word that's from Indic, but I don't think it's direct. I think it's from other Austroasiatic languages, such as Khmer. You'll see what that is later. The French colonial period, I'm not too worried about that, but I have to include it because it's there. But then I discovered there are a lot of words in Vietnamese that have no apparent source in other languages. I suspect then, certainly one possibility, that these are Vietnamese lexical innovations, and there's quite a few of them. Uncertain historical depth, but when I check the textual evidence, we at least get some general points of reference. So these are the periods that I'm looking at. These are the etymological sources. So that's what I'm going to do now. We're going to start to look at the categories. So we start with tailoring, and I'm using the term tailoring. It's a funny word to use, but let's say just to weave, to plait, to sew, to mend. And we look first at the native words. So Proto-Austroasiatic, Proto-Vietic, Proto-Viet Minh. And when I do this, it's because, what makes this Proto-Viet Minh? What makes this Proto-Viet Minh is I can't find it outside of the Vietnamese, Hmong, or Nguyen languages and dialects. Okay, so that's what I do. Could it be older? Yes, hypothetically so. At the very least, that's what we can reconstruct. Okay, so it's not impossible for it to be older, but when I check all of the data, I don't find cognates for this form. Okay, so that's what the approach I've taken here. Dan here for to weave is very old, Proto-Austroasiatic. This is in all 13 branches of Austroasiatic. So this is a very deep Proto-Austroasiatic word, to weave. So it is very much part of the Proto-Austroasiatic dispersal. Okay, some of these here a little later, right? Proto-Vietic. Okay. Now for loanwords, well, some Chinese loanwords here. Those early Chinese loanwords in the late Middle Chinese. These here to weave approximately, or more like plate, I think that's more of the term, and to embroider. And when we see to embroider, we're starting to see, okay, well, that kind of looks like something that we might expect from Chinese cultural contact, right? By the way, I am mostly confident that these are early Chinese loanwords based on the semantics and phonological features of these, and I'm not going to discuss them. I obviously don't have time to do that. When I look at the late Middle Chinese forms, those of course would be Chinese character readings, so I could look in a dictionary and find them. However, for these two, I've actually included them even though they appear to be semantic extension. That is, the original Chinese form, this jie and le, these are not really used for these words. So I'm actually, they have exactly the same phonological form. Get is the Chinese character reading for this jie word. So I'm putting it in here. It's hypothetical. But I don't see a reason to not include them at this point. But if I describe it in text, I would have to note that. Okay, and now for words in this category, but they are Vietnamese only. I cannot find them in other languages, not in Dai, not in Chinese. I can't find them in other languages. Look at that. That's a lot. Okay, these are early textual instances, so they have some historical depth. And of course, if someone here were to check, who's a specialist in Nome, were to check these, I'm sure that they could find, fill in blanks or find earlier attestations. Of course, they can't go into the first millennium. They can only find them in the second millennium because Nome does not go back that far. So, but at the very least, we can say, okay, these have some historical depth, but they do not appear to be, for example, Viet Minh words. They appear to be Vietnamese. And so there's a lot of innovation going on. Okay, and we'll see that in other categories too. Okay. All right, implements. And when I say implements, needles, looms, scissors here. And these are, again, the early Chinese loanwords and late Middle Chinese. Ironic, I don't know if it's ironic, but needle, basically this one word borrowed multiple times. This one has to be the oldest because of the onset. This is the Chinese character reading, and this is presumably somewhere in between, unless someone can find another explanation. That's what it looks like, a triplet. This word is a problematic one because of the tone, but the phonological, the segments match quite well. The semantics are quite reasonable. But in any case, Chinese has certainly influenced has had lexical influence in this domain of implements. As for native words, I can only find this. So for weaver's shuttle, this toy word, and that's an important one. I find it only in Muong Bi with basically the same phonological form. So I can't tell if this is actually a Muong shared innovation from the past or maybe a later borrowing. So I marked this as a question mark. I don't know if it might just be a Vietnamese form, but I did find it in Muong. Here's one without any other related language forms. Okay. All right. So yes, some Chinese influence in this domain. Now I'm going to include baskets because they are woven. Okay. It's not what we consider to be textiles, but I realize it gives us some insight. So I will show this. So there is this Proto-Austroasiatic form, Nam, from the Proto-Austroasiatic Kdong here, and I won't go into the details. I've been working with Paul Sidwell on checking Shorto's Austroasiatic reconstructions that we have been, identifying those which are actual true Proto-Austroasiatic reconstructions because they have wide enough geographic distribution, and those which are maybe later innovations in Austroasiatic. And this one has a deep history. So winnowing is part of Austroasiatic culture, presumably. Okay. I don't find anything that's Proto-Vietic, but I find quite a few that are Proto-Viet Minh, baskets. Okay. And anyone who does field work in the region knows there are quite a few types of baskets, and they have quite a few different functions. These, I feel pretty good that these are actually Proto-Viet Minh because the Minh forms are differentiated enough from these by tones and other segmental features, so that they are probably Proto-Viet Minh, have considerable time depth. I found one word which might be an early Chinese loanword. I've never noticed before. I just noticed this one recently. The ah to o is not bad. The huin tone is reasonable. I shouldn't be explaining the phonology, but I think this one's actually reasonable, and it happens to have the exact same translation. But an ethnographer would need to check and see what this actually is. I'm not 100% sure. It's not impossible to be chance, but phonology is not bad. Here are the forms that are only in Vietnamese. That's a lot. Again, we see quite a few, and some of these have considerable depth, several hundred years in textual instances. So got some pretty good depth. I can't be absolutely sure that all of these are not in any other language. And if anyone can find something that's solid, that would be great. But otherwise, these are Vietnamese only forms. But what we should note here is that there are no, except for that one, there appear to be almost no Chinese loanwords. This is native. Baskets are native words in Vietnamese. The Chinese did not influence this lexical domain. That's all. So I think that's useful in contrast with other textiles, and we'll see more, of course. Okay, clothing. Ah, yes, of course. We want to see headwear, footwear, upper body, lower body garments. And here there are a few native etyma here. And this is not Proto-Austroasiatic, but I'm just calling it Austroasiatic because it is attested in Bahnaric, Katuic, Khmeric, and Vietic. So it's contained in a geographic region. And this conical hat, that typical conical hat, in Chinese, that's the Li word, which is spread into Dai languages as Lap or something like that. But this one is only in, as far as I can tell, only in these Austroasiatic languages. And there is a Damsan bronze with a kind of conical hat and one figure that someone showed me. So it does have some depth in Austroasiatic. Then sandals and skirt, and I don't know the difference between these two types. That the vai is the only one that I'm familiar with, but I don't, this was found in a dictionary, so I'm not totally sure what that is, but it looks like it's got some time depth being in Hmong. Okay, well, what we have here is pretty limited for the native words. For later period, Vietnamese only, there are more. But once we get to the Chinese ones, then we get some several instances of fairly important words. And so I'm going to include ao with this tone as an early Chinese loanword because this should have the hoi tone. I shouldn't explain it, but this is usually listed as the Sino-Vietnamese, the reading of that word, but this tone marks it as an early Chinese loanword. And there are early Chinese loanwords among the Chinese character readings. And I propose that this is one of them. But even if it isn't, it's still a Chinese loanword. Okay, it just was borrowed later. Mu, the hat word, very widespread also in Dayak languages, although they retain the K from Old Chinese. And then a few other words here. I'm not totally certain about these, and I would need more data to check on the phonological forms, see if they were, but also some late Middle Chinese forms, the Sino-Vietnamese readings. Some of these are archaic and not used so much. And of course, people don't walk around using imperial robes too often, but clearly Chinese lexical influence in the domain of clothing is present. Okay. Flat, other than clothing, we can look at flat spread items such as blankets, curtains, flags. Okay, so that's our next category of woven things. And Proto-Vietic lui here for a fishing net. That's a type of woven item. Okay, and it has considerable depth in it. It's kind of what we would expect from an early pre-Qin period, right? That sleeping mat, as far as I can tell, it is a reasonable Proto-Viet Minh word. Okay, so that's kind of what we would expect for, again, for early period there. Chinese words. Now, I am proposing that men, blanket, is from this Chinese word for cotton. And not 100% sure. The phonology matches, the tone matches. It's semantic shift if it is. If it's not, okay, I'll exclude it. But no one can argue about these words here. Flag, these net, mosquito net and such. These are quite reasonable, especially flag, of course. And what this tells you is that the Chinese coming south, they really needed mosquito nets. That's what this tells me. And then we have this later period, and this word here, carpet for Chinese, Chinese word for carpet here is kind of the thing we'd expect, and flag or banner. These kinds of things are not surprising. A couple of native words I can't find in other languages. That's got some pretty good depth there, that word, but I know that's the word I'm used to using. I'm not used to the Chăn word in Vietnamese. Okay, so fabrics and materials, things we make those things with. And there's a good handful here of native words, Proto-Vietic for thread, different types of words, and I don't know how to distinguish these completely, but both of them have this approximate meaning of thread. A word for something meaning rag or something like that, okay. That's good because we saw those spindle whorls, and there is evidence of these kinds of threads. So that's good. That matches the archaeological record. Doesn't tell us what they did with it, but it tells us that there was thread. Good. And there's rags. There's something left over, but not a lot in what was made with it. That's the difficult part. Okay, rattan and cotton here. I'm proposing that it could be related to the word for flower, and I don't know. I'm just, this is speculation because of the shared phonological form and the possible relationship between this, because it would be a later stage innovation. But what is important is this word here, and that word is material or fabric, and it is very widespread in Austroasiatic as well as Dayak and Sanskrit, karpāsa, and I know that vai has only one syllable, and I won't go through all of the details how karpāsa becomes vai, but it does. And it has old textual attestation in old Khmer texts dating back to, I think, the year 600, something like that, meaning that this was certainly from the early part of the first millennium CE. And I don't think it was spread into Vietnamese directly from Indic, but I don't know. I don't have that knowledge about history, but I know that obviously lots of Sanskrit words were spread into Khmer. In any case, that is a Indic sourced word, a very important item. And then we have the Chinese stuff. I'm not going to go over all of this. Obviously, we have seen influence in the implements, we've seen implements in the clothing, and we see implements in the materials. And a lot of it having to do with silk, embroidered silk, and silk again, and silk, silk, silk. And yet in the archaeological record, I thought maybe silk would have started in mainland Southeast Asia with the arrival of the Chinese, but I have seen both Vietnamese archaeologists and Cambodian archaeologists who hypothesized that silk production predated the Chinese arrival. So I don't know what to say, but I can say that the Chinese loaned a lot of words related to silk production to the Vietnamese from a very early period. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. And then the native words. The purely Vietnamese type here, excluding the French type. I don't need to say anything particular about those, but the ones that are Vietnamese, this one, look at this first one, soy, for coarse silk. I found it as early as the 1200s in texts. If these are all Vietnamese innovations, they were still innovating words related to silk. They didn't give up. And we can see that the phonological forms are, well, they don't look Chinese either. They are natural, native-looking things, not Chinese-looking things. So when you check in the dictionaries, they don't pop up as Chinese. No. Okay. Colors. Now, colors obviously are not the materials themselves, but colors are used in combination with their production. And we saw that in the materials, I'll back that up here, such as to dye, the cinnabar for that color and that sort of thing. By the way, this Nuam word, this is very widespread in Austroasiatic, in Kradai, Hmong Mien, and Tibeto-Burman. Very widespread form. Chinese dyeing apparently spread widely. That's what it looks like, at least lexically. Okay, back over here for those colors. So just to briefly, we can argue about the meaningfulness of the Berlin and K, establishment of basic color terms. It doesn't matter whether we agree with them or not. It is the case that the native Vietnamese words here, Proto-Vietic and Proto-Viet Minh here, have those basic ones. So black, white, and red in this early period. Not Austroasiatic, and I don't know why, and I guess it's just too much time depth, whatever. This is what we have. But basically pretty, the basic color terms are in native words. Some later innovations, apparently. We can see this as semantic extension from a type of tree. It's an archaic term. I don't believe it's used anymore. Okay, so what about the Chinese stuff? And lots of Chinese words. And now, this is complicated. I've written about this partially because some of these have to do with the terms that were for, oops, I went too far, for silver and gold. And in Vietnamese, vàng has this double meaning of yellow and gold, and it's from this word yellow, and this is from white. And oh, by the way, if there's this old Chinese form with the BR onset, and that's the source for a number of mainland Southeast Asian languages, which have something like parak or something, brak. That's all. It's silver. And the early Chinese way of referring to silver and gold was basically saying the white metal and the yellow metal. And so this is what we have. But then we see these other kinds of non-basic words, the blue-green kind of word, and purple. All right, purple is not a basic color. And so we get additional colors, a wide range of colors, also in going into the late Middle Chinese period here. And I've included cam here, orange, although I shouldn't actually, it's when it was used to mean the color, that's a different matter. I would actually have to justify that through textual evidence. So I don't know if I'll keep that later. But anyways, Chinese has had a lot of influence in this semantic subdomain. Okay, so some concluding observations here. The pre-Qin words, such as to weave, winnowing basket, to mend, skirt, fishing net, sleeping mat, thread, words for baskets, many words, and basic color terms are native words in Vietnamese from Austroasiatic and Vietic. That's pretty good. Vietnamese is not a Chinese dialect. It has not been totally relexified. It has been lexically embellished, but it has a good solid core of terms. But Chinese has had a major impact from the first millennium into the second millennium, and all the semantic subcategories: clothing, decorations, fabrics, the materials, the implements to make them, and the colors. Although the category of baskets is almost entirely native, that one instance that basically recently identified him. I have to argue against it, and I don't think I can. It's one word. A few Chinese words spread into languages regionally, such as dye, as I mentioned. Oh, loom, I forgot to mention that. It's Vietnamese, Dayak, and Chamic as well. That word hat, that upper body garment, I forgot to mention that. The thao word is in a number of Austroasiatic languages. I believe it spread from Vietnamese, but I can't be sure. It didn't spread directly from Chinese, but I suspect it spread from Vietnamese, but we don't know. What I think this also shows is an early area of exchange among Austroasiatic languages in mainland Southeast Asia. We saw that with that word for cotton from Indic, but it's widespread among the languages, mainland Southeast Asia, Austroasiatic languages, and others. Conical hat, and I'll add this, it's not for this category, of course, but this ploughshare word is another possible example. The large number of words found only in Vietnamese suggests socio-cultural developments and relevant textile practices in Vietnam in the second millennium. And I would need someone who is an ethnographer to really check into these. This is obviously outside of what I can do. I can share the data. I can say this data is interesting. But someone who is an ethnographer would actually need to check that sort of thing. I can't know what I can't make any more claims than there are a lot of these words, and they appear to be only in Vietnamese, not in other languages. So, and finally, the lexical data matches archaeological and historical descriptions in many ways, and it's actually not always, but I think it does. There's certainly some interesting ways in which it does complement the archaeohistorical data, and I hope that some people who study in archaeology and ethnohistory pay attention to some of this data, and perhaps might find something of benefit to them, as I have found from their data. Okay, so I think that's what I'd like to be able to say. And whoops, thank you very much for your attention. Oh, and this is the bark cloth there from a brew speaker there. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. I will stop sharing. And